Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I'm also someone who is breaking new ground. I, today, am coming to you with my friend, John Steinbeck. Those of you on the podcast might be a little confused and might be a little curious how I have conjured, the California literary master from the dead. I, in fact, have not conjured anyone. I am sitting here with a fourth grade art project by one of my children. This is in fact John Steinbeck, although it looks an awful lot like either Groucho Marx or Cesar Chavez, depending on your frame of reference. It is, in fact, John Steinbeck, the fabled writer from California, and I am very excited today to have conjured him in order to speak about East of Eden, which is arguably his masterpiece. So we like to begin at the Fox Page with this question of why read this book. And recently we dove into James by Percival Everett, which was an unbelievably great read. And in order to get the most out of that, we took a look at Mark Twain's Huck Finn. And looking at Adventures of Huckleberry Finn made me think a lot about these stories of America, these stories that have really sort of been touted as like very important regionalist novels, as pieces of work that are old for sure, and just very much about who we are as Americans. So I was very excited about the idea of revisiting John Steinbeck, and I actually had never read East of Eden. I loved Cannery Row when I was in high school, probably because it was so short, and I had honestly never read anything else. I think maybe I read Grapes of Wrath, but I have to say it did not maybe leave that much of an impression on me. There was a period of time when I was really not into realism, so it may have fallen during that period of time. But I was really excited about this notion of digging into East of Eden. For some reason, I've been drawn recently into also long books. I also was really excited about the idea of really digging into the California landscape. I am a native Californian, and I recently actually drove down through the Salinas Valley and just really, really was sort of captured by the hills and by the, I didn't actually see the Salinas River, but really by all of that landscape, by just the beauty of that part of the country. And so I was really excited to sort of dig into the literature of someone who, in fact, immortalized that part of the country. And then I have to say, I was so drawn in to this book. As most of you know, who've been listening to the Fox Page, I generally am not that interested in plot, but for some reason, good old-fashioned storytelling here really got to me, and I was very invested in the plot. There were lots of questions that I was sort of dying to have answered. Even the times when it seemed all a bit heavy-handed, I was just really found myself kind of captured and drawn into the text. I will also say that description of place and description of people was not disappointing. I really had high expectations for the depiction of California, and certainly of California history. I actually felt like I had learned a lot by the time I finished the book. So it was really a very engrossing experience. I also kept thinking that I would end up skimming big chunks because I was like, if he's going to get really deep into description or if there's sort of a plot line that I'm not that interested in following, it's a big fat book. So I was like, maybe I'm going to do some skimming. And no, there were almost no times when I wanted to do any skimming. I also wanted to read this book because for a lot of people, East of Eden is one of those novels where I say to people, oh, I'm reading East of Eden. And they're like, oh my God, I loved that book. For a lot of people, it's a very sort of nostalgic thing. And a lot of people are like, oh, that's one of my favorite novels, or oh my God. In fact, a lot of men are like, oh, loved East of Eden. So I also was interested in the idea of helping people understand, even if they're not going to reread it, helping people understand why, in fact, this novel would have been such a favorite. Okay, so those of you who like an agenda, I'm going to give you the agenda here. We're going to dive into a very quick biography of John Steinbeck. We're going to then talk about some strengths of the novel. We'll be talking about realism, the narrative voice, the use of history, and good old-fashioned storytelling. And also the way that John Steinbeck does an amazing job of creating tension with both small dramatic arcs and larger dramatic arcs, which are really well done, and both are very well utilized. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the weaknesses, mostly this idea of the biblical. He tends to lean a little heavily into the biblical, which, you might guess given the title of this novel. There are lots of digressions, which, I love a good digression, but I think other people sometimes have a hard time with them. I also think some of the typing of good and evil, some of that got a little bit heavy-handed. So we're going to be looking a little bit at that. And then we're going to be looking a bit at the racism in the book. It was a book that was obviously written in the first half of the 20th century, but it actually harkened back to a much earlier time. So the depiction of Asian people and Irish people in particular, it's a complicated sort of depiction, and it's one that we're going to take a look at. Okay. We're going to dive in now to the biography of John Steinbeck. He was born in 1902 in Salinas and died in 1968. When he was 17 years old, he went to Stanford. He was there for sort of 6 years, kind of in and out. And anyone who remembers East of Eden well will remember that when Aaron goes to Stanford, it is not, in fact, a successful experience for him. So, you can draw your own conclusions, but I imagine perhaps that there's a little bit of an autobiographical stamp there. So he spent 6 years kind of in and out of literature classes at Stanford, and actually did not graduate with a degree. In 1962, he won the Nobel Prize for literature, and this is what the Nobel Committee said about him. They gave him the prize for his realistic and imaginative writings, combining, as they do, sympathy, humor, and keen social perception. So I think this is so cool. I love that the Nobel Prize gives kind of like a little recap of what, in fact, they found so incredible about the writing. They did it with Annie Ernaux. If you're interested in a French Nobel Prize winning author, you should go check out the lecture on The Years by Annie Ernaux. So in 1962, he won the Nobel Prize. East of Eden had come out in 1952. He was totally prolific. There were 33 novels. People mostly remember Grapes of Wrath, East of Eden, Cannery Row, and Of Mice and Men. Of Mice and Men is one of those ones that gets anthologized a lot, and it's read, I think, even like in middle school. And I think, it's probably one of those books that would be really interesting to go back and look at as a more mature reader. Things like, Catcher in the Rye, or even The Great Gatsby, and certainly To Kill a Mockingbird. Those are books that we read when we are young, and that's a great thing. But I think revisiting them is very interesting because obviously they are very sophisticated and interesting pieces of art. And, potentially when you're in 7th grade, you may not have gotten all of the nuances. He lived in California, obviously in his youth, was in New York for quite some time, and then moved back to California. I believe he had 2 different marriages, one of which did not end well. I think his wife at the time, soon to be ex-wife, had a lot of affairs and maybe was very open about them. I'm not giving you like the definitive biography of John Steinbeck, but their marriage ended badly. And in fact, it is important to keep in mind that he was writing East of Eden soon after his breakup of his marriage. And, the sort of thinking is that perhaps a lot of the evil qualities in Kathy come directly from that experience of having been betrayed, quote unquote betrayed. I don't know what the story is. That's why I'm quote unquoting stuff. He had 2 boys, Tom and John. And my sense is that he was not like a super attentive father. I think they spent quite a bit of time with their mother in New York City. But again, I am not the definitive expert on John Steinbeck's personal life. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and dive into the text. So I love this edition so much. I actually love it so much that I busted out all the other, these are penguins. I busted out all the other penguins, and I'm interested in the fact that all of them are very male. We've got this stack over here with Thomas Pynchon and William Gaddis. It's just a whole lot of Gaddis and Pynchon, and I love both of those authors, and I love John Steinbeck. I mean, the thing also they have in common is those guys wrote some really large books. They're books that in my mind are very male. I went through a period of time, I mean, again, this might have to do with my idea of like authority males and authority figures and my kind of weird reverence for like adult males. That sounds really weird. You know what I mean? Like when I was younger, I think I was trying to figure out like what's up with men. And I really took a deep dive. So anyway, I really enjoyed the fact that our John Steinbeck was in such good company over here in the Penguin section, and I actually ended up buying this copy in London, and I was really wanting to read East of Eden, and it was the one copy of John Steinbeck that they had. And as a Californian, I had kind of this nice sense of pride, that they were in fact carrying exactly the California novel that I really felt like I needed to read while I was in England. Okay, so I really like the art. I love the way this, to me, this window on the front here, for those of you on the podcast and not on the YouTube, it's like a very, it almost looks like a church kind of a window, but it is definitely something that you would have seen in Salinas or maybe in like West Marin or in parts of San Francisco, maybe parts of the peninsula here in the Bay Area. It's a very old sort of architecture that definitely was not Spanish colonial, and to me really marks the 19th and early 20th centuries in California. So it's appropriate that it be kind of this church-like window on the front because obviously the title of the book is East of Eden, which is very much steeped in the biblical. So a lot of the book hews to this biblical thing. The term East of Eden comes from the book of Genesis, and this is when Cain kills his brother and he is banished to the land of Nod, which is east of Eden. So you have this very strong sense of the Edenic, meaning, obviously things in the Garden of Eden, everybody was happy. Adam and Eve were very happy. They were innocent. And, happy men and women and innocence is not at all what is coloring this novel. So it is, in fact, I think, a very apt title, this idea of being banished, this idea of being, because you are being punished for, in Cain's case, it's a murder, but because people are punished, they are, in fact, sent east of Eden. So, of course, in the book, we have people moving from the eastern part of the United States out to California as this kind of promised land. And in fact, there is a lot of Edenic kind of promise in California. But for many of the people in the novel, it doesn't quite work out that way. So we really do have a sense of this title, I think, as being excellent. And a lot of the biblical stuff, again, it hews very closely to the book of Genesis. There are lots of people in this book whose names either start with a C or an A. And in fact, in almost every case, they are falling into the camp of either Cain or Abel. So I think that you can feel like that's a little heavy-handed, but I also think that it's really skillful the way that that Steinbeck is being pretty clear about the biblical references. So before we dive into actually the text itself, I want to make a quick comment on realism. So realism was a sort of an art movement in literature. And, I'm not sure sometimes of the value of this kind of label, but I do actually like the way that thinking about these movements and thinking about, certain sort of characteristics of fiction can, in fact, enrich our understanding of them. And I also really like thinking about the way that these different movements played against each other. And often they're very informed by some sort of social movements, which again, tying history and literature together or societal, movements together with literature is always, I think, a useful endeavor. So realism was a type of writing that came in sort of the late 1800s. So a lot of people think of Madame Bovary, actually, by Flaubert, as the first and sort of finest example of realism. So that's in 1856. But this idea of realism really does come into its own in kind of mid to late 1800s. So what characterizes realism is this idea of an omniscient narrator, so a third person all-knowing narrator. And this is very important because it's kind of this like supposedly neutral and supposedly objective God-like narrator who is telling this story in a way that is kind of unbiased, but is also, again, all-knowing. So what this is seeking to do is to provide for the reader a very complete vision of a certain world. And in Flaubert's case, part of the desire was to have this kind of democratic feel in the sense that he was talking about the petite bourgeoisie and not For those of you who tuned into Jane Austen, a lot of that is sort of upper middle class stuff. He's really trying to talk about, the sort of down and dirty stuff that we are getting in a more realist novel. So instead of talking about drawing rooms and, sort of the finery and really relying on snappy dialogue like we see in Jane Austen, what the realist novel is doing is hoping to show us things like what people were eating, where they were going to the bathroom, what kinds of sicknesses they had, what their underclothes looked like. So it's this idea of really, those are all very like kind of gross things, but it is this idea of showing gross things, showing kind of the real and sort of the entire lives. So there's very heavy description. And if the realist writer is worth their salt, that description is in fact very telling. So it also is a little bit of this idea of everyman, this idea of showing, what life is like for all different classes and for all different people, not just, this aristocracy, which would have been the subject of a lot of fiction in the 18th century. So Steinbeck is actually always my kind of go-to for an American realist writer. And he is a little later. Again, this is 1952 that East of Eden is coming out. So it's almost 100 years after Madame Bovary. But it does, in fact, supply us with a very good example of a realist type of novel. So with that in mind, we are going to dive into the text. And actually, there's a note right before we get to the actual heart of the text that John Steinbeck has written to Pascal Covici, who was a friend of his. So in this note to Pascal, he is talking about the novel that he is sort of presenting in some ways to Pascal Covici. Nearly everything I have is in it, and it is not full. Pain and excitement are in it, and feeling good or bad, and evil thoughts and good thoughts, the pleasure of design and some despair, and the indescribable joy of creation. And on top of these are all the gratitude and love I have for you, and still the box is not full. So this idea of everything being in here, all of these contrary emotions, the idea of creation, these things are also very biblical, and they're really leaning into this kind of good and evil thing that John Steinbeck is taking from the Bible. But we also have this idea of creating an entire world, of this being full of everything, or as close to everything as John Steinbeck can get it, which is in fact a very realist impulse. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the actual text. The Salinas Valley is in Northern California. It is a long, narrow swale between two ranges of mountains, and the Salinas River winds and twists up the center until it falls at last into Monterey Bay. So this is such a good example of this kind of really pulled back vision, this very sort of far away, omniscient narrator. This is like if you imagine a cinematographic kind of moment. This is the camera that is pulled way, way, way back, and we are seeing, in fact, the entire state of California, if not, the entire United States. And with a statement like, the Salinas Valley is in Northern California, that is a perfect example of this kind of omniscient narrator who is going to declare things, and they are going to be true, and they are going to be provable. So you have this idea right away of looking very far away. We're looking at Northern California, the Salinas Valley, and then we are kind of homing in, and we're getting closer toward this narrow swale, which is kind of this depression between these two ranges of mountains, which become very important and really emblematic for our folks here in East of Eden, very emblematic of good and bad, of good and evil. And then this idea of it moving toward Monterey Bay. So we have this idea of kind of moving towards something, and then we have this omniscient narrator move in a bit closer. I remember my childhood names for grasses and secret flowers. I remember where a toad may live and what time the birds awaken in the summer, and what trees and seasons smelled like, how people looked and walked and smelled even. The memory of odors is very rich. So this is interesting because I just got finished telling you that this is a good example of the realist novel, and that usually that is told in a third person, and that is true. And in fact, this first person narrator in East of Eden has come under a bit of fire. Pardon me, John Steinbeck, for saying that this is perhaps something that people are critical of. But people do have a bit of a problem because this first person narrator kind of intrudes and then steps back. And certainly the third person omniscient narrator knows much, much more than the first person narrator could possibly know. So I don't mind at all this kind of toggling between the third and the first person, but for some people it's an inconsistency that kind of rankles, which, I mean, I think that's kind of lame, but oh well, there you are. The other thing that's really interesting to me about this first person narrator is that we are having, in some ways, the best of both worlds. So we have this really pulled back third person narrator that is giving us kind of this big expanse and is omniscient and proclaiming, these geographical facts. And then we have someone who's giving us a very subjective sense of this. Also, any writer worth his or her salt is really going to be able to include all five senses. And that is some of the reason why, in fact, the descriptions of California are so rich and so productive in lots of ways and so evocative. Because, in fact, Steinbeck here, he's really leaning into the idea of smells, which is if you can, work smell into anything you're writing, you're definitely on the right track. So already we have this third person narrator and we have this much more subjective and, in fact, much more kind of sensual first person narrator. You also have a sense here that this first person narrator is talking from a point in the future. This is someone who is looking back on his childhood, and we actually don't know who this narrator is, which I always love that. I love the idea of you have this voice and you don't yet know who it is, when in fact this person is in fact going to show up. We're going to take a closer look at the narrative voice in a bit. Okay, but we're going to move down a little further to this third paragraph here. I remember that the Gabalan Mountains to the east of the valley were light gray mountains full of sun and loveliness and a kind of invitation, so that you wanted to climb into their warm foothills, almost as if you wanted to climb into the lap of a beloved mother. They were beckoning mountains with a brown grass love. The Santa Lucias stood against the sky to the west and kept the valley from the open sea, and they were dark and brooding, unfriendly and dangerous. I always found in myself a dread of west and a love of east. Where I ever got such an idea, I cannot say, unless it could be that the morning came over the peaks of the Gabalans and the night drifted back from the ridges of the Santa Lucias. It might be that birth and death of the day had some part in my feeling about the two ranges of mountains. So here again, we are leaning pretty heavily into this idea of good and bad. It has everything to do with lightness and darkness, morning time and evening, death, birth and death. So you have really this introduction from the beginning of this idea of good and bad. And east and west are tied to that, but we are also clued into the fact that that's not going to be such an easy kind of distinction for him to uphold. Okay, and then the last paragraph that we're going to look at here on page 1. From both sides of the valley, little streams slipped out of the hill canyons and fell into the bed of the Salinas River. In the winter of wet years, the streams ran full freshet, and they swelled the river until sometimes it raged and boiled bank full, and then it was a destroyer. So you have this idea here too of something that is sustaining, something that is, beautiful, something that has created, in fact, this valley, but also something that can cause destruction. So from the beginning, we have quite a focus here on the idea of a mother and of mother nature. And mothers, in fact, get to be very, very complicated in this book. So this idea of part of the hills being like the lap of a mother, and then this idea of sort of mother nature and the river as being really like a source of life, but also a source of destruction. So we are getting a lot in this very first page, and this is how rich the text feels throughout. It's so beautifully done. And some of the description here, the choice of words is so evocative and so telling. It's not even what they mean. In fact, sometimes I didn't even know what they meant, but you just get so much of an idea of what the landscape looks like, even because of the sounds of the river. This is a very good example. In the winter of wet years, the streams ran full freshet, and they swelled the river until sometimes it raged and boiled bank full, and then it was a destroyer. So this idea of streams ran full freshet, we have this repetition of these words. In this case, they're either sibilants or fricatives, which are both, those are sounds that are going to carry things along. It's not like a plosive or a stop where you have like a t or a b. But instead, you have this idea of these kind of flowing sounds, full freshet, which I don't even know what that means, full freshet, but it really gives you a sense of the freshness of the river. And all of those sibilants, those S sounds, really do sound in some regard like water. The streams ran full freshet, they swelled until sometimes. So you have all of that repetition of that S sound, which is very much like a kind of a river sound. And then it raged and boiled bank full. So that bank full idea is so evocative of the idea of banks, of running into something, and the idea of a delineation, but also this idea of full, like the idea of bank full is such a beautiful kind of evocation of the river as in fact being very full. The word full, it's not, it's not exactly describing what it is, but you do have this sense of those nice vowel sounds and those liquid L's and the fricative F there, as really sort of telling you what you are supposed to be seeing with the vowel sounds, which is just such a feat in many ways. So the opening of the novel gives us a really good sense of what this kind of realist fiction seems like in terms of its narrative stance. But we have later in the novel some very good examples of this kind of the gritty part of realism, where the author is really seeking to show us things that are not, in fact, what you would have had in even in the beginning of the 19th century. So we have, this is not really too much of this is not a spoiler, and you don't even really need to know what these people are, this is not a spoiler, and you actually don't even really need to know what the setup is here, because I think you can get a sense. Here we're learning about some of the grittier things. We're also learning what they're having when they're eating it, that sort of thing. So on page 509, at 1 o'clock in the morning, Hal and Joe went to Barlow's Grill. 2 rib steaks and French fries. You want soup? Hal asked Joe. No, and no French fries. They bind me up. So here we have this idea not only of what they're ordering, but the fact that one of them gets constipated from the French fries. And we have an expression for what that constipation would be. So this is exactly the kind of thing that the realist novel is actually helping us to see. And I think actually, no pun intended, there's a lot of appetite for that. In fact, you have some people like Upton Sinclair and Émile Zola who were pushing the realist novel a little further. And really, then it becomes a movement called naturalism, where they're trying to enact social change by showing things like, terrible sanitation in the meatpacking situation in Chicago on the part of Upton Sinclair. I think it's Chicago. Or, in the case of Émile Zola, like what those, what the meatpacking plants or what the, the laundry situations are looking like in France, and the way that those working conditions were in fact really, really brutal. It really fit well with kind of the realist novel, pushed 1 degree further into naturalism. And then a little further down, also on page 509, we have another example of realism. She was not a bad woman, lazy, sloppy, but good-hearted. She wanted dignity and importance. She was just not very bright and not very pretty, and because of these 2 lacks, not very lucky. It would have bothered Ethel if she had known that when they pulled her out of the sand where the waves had left her half buried, her skirts were pulled up around her ass. She would have liked more dignity. So obviously the thing that I'm pointing to here is this idea of ass, this idea also of how this woman's dead body is being found. So you have these details, in fact, that are very telling and very revealing, and certainly not the kind of thing that you would see in Jane Austen. This is also a very good example of something that I should have mentioned already, which is that this book is really, there's a decent amount of misogyny here. I mentioned earlier that Steinbeck was just, at the end of his marriage was falling apart. And, so I think he had a lot of anger toward women at this point. I also think, as somebody, a man who grew up at the beginning of the 20th century, there's a certain attitude toward women that is not what it might be today. That is not to excuse the misogyny, but looking at the misogyny is actually very interesting because the women who are in the book are incredibly powerful. I mean, there are women in here who are really, really formidable folks. So I think sometimes, it's important to look at the ways, in fact, that Steinbeck perhaps was threatened, and certainly the way that these characters in the book are threatened by the power of women. Okay, so we are going to move on from realism, and we're going to talk a little more about the narrative voice. I mentioned earlier that it is sort of uncommon to have this first-person narrator combined, but I really enjoyed it myself. I think it really added something to this sort of normal, omniscient third-person narrator. But I want to take a closer look at how this first-person narrator does, in fact, kind of keep intruding on the novel, coming kind of in and out in ways, again, that I think are very additive. So in my book on page 12, this is one of those kind of meta moments, which I'm always a sucker for, where the narrator, if it is a first-person narrator, is going to try to convince us, in fact, that they know all of this stuff, that they have some kind of access to information that allows them to be omniscient. It never quite works, but I'm always interested in how an author will try to explain how one person has all of the information. So again, this is the beginning of chapter 2. In my book, it's on page 12. I must depend on hearsay, on old photographs, on stories told, and on memories which are hazy and mixed with fable in trying to tell you about the Hamiltons. They were not eminent people, and there are few records concerning them except for the usual papers on birth, marriage, land ownership, and death. Young Samuel Hamilton came from the north of Ireland, and so did his wife. He was the son of small farmers, neither rich nor poor, who had lived on one landhold and in one stone house for many hundreds of years. So this is the perfect example because in the beginning, he's like, oh, I know about this family, the Hamiltons, because of photographs and hearsay and, things that I have read and heard. But then, so that's in the first paragraph of chapter 2. Then we have the second paragraph that really is sliding into that third person omniscient. I mean, it's not exactly our first person narrator, and we don't know his identity yet, who would say in this tone, this is so obviously the third person because this is not exactly the tone that our first person narrator would use when in the second paragraph we have this. Young Samuel, when we have that thing about young Samuel Hamilton came from the north of Ireland and so did his wife. He was the son of small farmers, neither rich nor poor, who had lived on one landhold and in one stone house for many hundreds of years. So that voice in tone is very much like that third person narrator that we have at the very beginning. So I think you can argue here that it's kind of a, he's making a nod, Steinbeck, at giving this first person narrator all of the information. But in fact, we are leaning fairly heavily on the third. We also have another way that this narrator departs a little bit from this idea of the omniscient third-person narrator, and that is because this narrative voice occasionally, it goes into that first person, but it also is entering into the minds of other characters in a way that is, I think, very effective, but it certainly is a departure. And I was very interested in all of the different ways, in fact, that Steinbeck is modifying this omniscient third-person narrator. So on page 27, we have a conversation between Cyrus, there's one of our C names, and Adam. So these are brothers of a generation above the sort of Cain and Abel characters. Well, they're all sort of Cain and Abel characters, but before the youngest ones that are sort of the main thrust of the book. So this is one generation up, and we have Cyrus and Adam talking. Cyrus explained softly to Adam the nature of a soldier. And though his knowledge came from research rather than experience, he knew and was accurate. So we have this kind of bridge here between the narrator, this omniscient third-person narrator, and Cyrus. He's like, Cyrus is explaining this thing to Adam, but he's actually correct. And I am sort of, approving of this, which makes, in fact, the third-person omniscient narrator the authority and sort of bestowing. It's like Cyrus is his deputy. He's deputizing Cyrus and is like, actually, he can be the narrator for a minute. So then a little further down, Cyrus says this: "We take a soldier and put murder in his hands, and we say to him, use it well, use it wisely. We put no checks on him. Go out and kill as many of a certain kind or classification of your brothers as you can, and we will reward you for it because it is a violation of your early training." Adam wet his dry lips and tried to ask and failed again. "Why do they have to do it?" He said. "Why is it?" Cyrus was deeply moved, and he spoke as he had never spoken before. "I don't know." So again, we have this third person narrator who's moving very, very close to this Cyrus character. And this happens again and again. And it's actually excellent because it's not that Cyrus is talking in the first person, but we are getting so close to him that we feel like we have kind of access to, his inner thoughts, which is, it's very effective in terms of helping us understand the motivations and the reactions of all of these different characters. On page 185, we have a situation where the plot is thickening. So this is a very interesting part. The plot thickens here in the sense that we have this omniscient third-person narrator, but this narrator is withholding information. This can be very frustrating for readers, but I actually think it works very well in this case. So on 185, we again have this narrator that's pulling back. It's first person, technically this is first person, but it's also really giving us sort of a broader swath of information here. But that first person narrator allows that feeling that information is in fact being held back. So on page 185, "When I said Kathy was a monster, it seemed to me that it was so. Now I have bent close with a glass over the small print of her and reread the footnotes, and I wonder if it was true. The trouble is that since we cannot know what she wanted, we will never know whether or not she got it." And then a little further down, "It is easy to say she was bad, but there is little meaning unless we know why." And then at the bottom of the page, we have this kind of more omniscient pronouncement made that is really tying us back to the biblical. "A woman was likely to have strange tastes. Some said for filth, and it was set down to the Eve nature, still under sentence for original sin." Original sin. Original thin. Oh my God. I just quickly developed a speech impediment there. But this idea of Kathy as being really like literally under a microscope and looking at the footnotes, we have the mechanism kind of pulled back, much like with the Hamiltons and the photographs and the hearsay and whatnot. But we're really trying to understand these characters. And I think Steinbeck does a beautiful job of using all of the different narrative voices that are welcome, that are available to him. And then we have really what was just kind of a shocker for me. My marginalia here is just really something. On page 283, we have this bombshell. So this is a case of this young boy who we have been sort of following along, and he is with this character who is an uncle of his, and he's trying to sort of win him over, and he has this toy. We actually had these. My grandmother, my beloved maternal grandmother, brought them back from Mexico, and it was horrible. It was like a little piggy, and for the butt, it had like a little plug, and you would catch a fly and put it in there and plug it, and it would make the ears of the piggy scoot around, and the little legs scoot around. Terrible, terrible, terrible. But it was very recognizable. Maybe Steinbeck also got his from Mexico. But here we have this young person who we have been following and who has been using the first person. And he is showing this kind of little contraption to this uncle who he's trying to impress. He says this: "You see, you pull up a pin to get the fly in, and then he sits in there and buzzes. I'd like to have it very much. Thank you, John." And then I freaked out because, in fact, it was you, John Steinbeck. It was John Steinbeck. So we realize really late in the novel, we're 300 pages in to, what is this, a 600-page novel. And that is when we realize, in fact, that our narrator is some fictive version of John Steinbeck himself. The novel is 602 pages long. So I love that. I love the fact that we don't know for a long time, but we finally are figuring out that this first person narrator is in fact meant to be, John Steinbeck, which, I mean, again, I love anything that kind of is pointing to the artifice of the fact that we are holding something in our hands that is being created by an author, but I also love this melding and this bridging between the idea of sort of what is truth and what is real, and whether or not this is kind of more memoir-esque than we would have originally given it credit for. So all of that is done with this narrative voice and with all of these different nuances that Steinbeck is adding to this standard realist narration. It's so good. Okay. I want to talk about sense of place, which is in fact much more straightforward, but I love the idea of this allowing us to take just a somewhat closer glance at the really, really beautiful prose. So this is on page 121, and you can imagine here that the person whose name is Adam in the book, I don't know how much, all of you readers out there are remembering of the book. It doesn't really matter. I hope today what I'm giving you is a sense of like why it's so good. And again, part of that is this incredible narrative voice and the sense of place. The plot is kind of, I'll leave that to you. Either you can go back and read the book, or you can just kind of let this wash over you. The plot is not something that I'm really discussing. What we're digging into here is why, in fact, the book is so affecting for so many people. On the bottom of 121, we have this description. Very Edenic, as the name Adam would suggest. Adam stood up and strode out of the room. He went to the back door and looked out on the afternoon. Far off in the field, his brother was lifting stones for a sled and piling them on a stone wall. Adam looked up at the sky. A blanket of herring clouds was rolling in from the east. He sighed deeply, and his breath made a tickling, exciting feeling in his chest. His ears seemed suddenly clear, so that he heard the chickens cackling and the east wind blowing over the ground. He heard horses' hoofs plodding on the road, and far off pounding on wood where a neighbor was shingling a barn. And all these sounds related into a kind of music. His eyes were clear, too. Fences and walls and sheds stood staunchly out in the yellow afternoon, and they were related too. There was change in everything. A flight of sparrows dropped into the dust and scrabbled for bits of food, and then flew off like a gray scarf twisting in the light. Adam looked back at his brother. He had lost track of time and did not know how long he had been standing in the doorway. Okay, we have to take a look at some of the excellent things that are happening. We're going to move backwards through this paragraph. First of all, the idea of him standing in a doorway, that is known as a liminal space. Whenever a character is in a space that is normally used to move through, so say it's a doorway, it's a hallway, it could be an airport terminal, anytime you have them in a liminal space, they are often, if your writer is worth their salt, they are often facing some sort of change or contemplating change, which is a cool concept. It's very logical, which, my favorite types of literary, devices are, in fact, usually very logical. That's why they work so well. But here we have him, in fact, in a doorway. He's also watching his brother, out there laboring, which has everything to do with this idea of Abel and Cain. So we have this biblical reference, we have this idea of the liminal space, and the idea of one brother looking at the other. But we're going to move backwards here, and this idea of a flight of sparrows dropping into the dust and scrabbling for bits of food. So the flight of sparrows is so beautiful because you have, again, the fricative and the sibilant noises, the F of flight. And then you have the sparrows and that repetition of S, which is kind of this nice movement. And then the idea of them dropping to the dust, it's almost like you can hear them kind of dropping in the dust, those D sounds and the nice vowel sound there. And then scrabbling for bits of food. So the idea of scrabbling, you obviously have that hard k sound, but this bits is also really evocative of like the little bits of things that they would be, scrabbling around for. It's really evocative of what, in fact, we are meant to be seeing. And then this idea, how they flew off like a gray scarf twisting in the light. I am someone who has very high expectations for metaphor and simile. This is a simile because it is a comparison that is using like. It's not one that I really, really love, but it's also not bad. The idea of a gray scarf twisting in the light, not bad. John, I'm going to give you a B+. I'm going to give you a B+ on that simile. Maybe an A-. just because of the merit of the rest of the work. And then when we move up a little further, this idea of the yellow afternoon, that to me is really, having grown up in California and understanding that everything he would be looking at would be that beautiful caramel colored hill and the yellow of the grasses, and the wood would be sort of bleached into that grayish yellow. So the idea of fences and walls and sheds stood staunchly out in the yellow afternoon. It's so beautiful. I find this evocation of a sense of place here as just so strong and so well done. And we see it again and again and again throughout the novel. It's you can feel the heat, and you can smell what it smells like, and you can hear the grasses, and you can see the softness of these caramel colored hills. It's really just very well done. Good job, John Steinbeck. Now that we've talked about the realist novel, the narrative voice, and the sense of place, I want to talk a little bit about the amazing way in which Steinbeck really creates a lot of tension. So it's obviously tension that will keep a reader turning pages, because you're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Things feel tense because you want information, or you're concerned about something happening or not happening. And he does such a good job of this. So we have these really beautiful kind of larger arcs that are occurring that keep our attention over long periods of time. Things like whether or not Kathy is going to kill Adam. I mean, that's a big one. That's a big one. Again, here we have a C letter with Kathy, and we have A with Adam. So we're having kind of a Cain and Abel thing here. So at one point, Kathy, they have a very violent interaction, and you really don't know exactly what is going to happen with that. Also, Kathy in general, she is someone who is sort of vilified, not even sort of, she's totally vilified throughout the book, but she is someone who's incredibly competent and incredibly independent. I mean, to a way that's actually very destructive. Also, I'm very interested in the depiction of sex in the book. So Kathy, I don't think this is a spoiler. And if it is, we're just going to have to let that stand. Maybe you want to, fast forward if you're concerned about a spoiler about Kathy. But she becomes... Are you ready? You ready for it? She becomes, in fact, a sex worker and really plies her trade very well and is very good at what she does. And in fact, she's known, for sort of satisfying everyone's kinks, which is earlier there was a reference to filth and women as, Eve-like women as being, sort of attracted to filth. So there's this real question throughout about sexuality that to me kind of, it really smacked of someone who is maybe perhaps not totally secure in his own sexuality. That might be kind of a hot take. But I do think that, this is someone who is very pro-sex, our Kathy, not even for her own pleasure, but for her sense of power. And in fact, there are several different, houses where sex workers work. I don't know what we call them anymore. Definitely not brothel. I don't know what we say. But anyway, those places are run by women who are in fact very strong and very capable. They don't always come to, the best end, all of these people who are running these houses with the sex workers in them and the sex workers themselves. But this idea of sex work is something the women have really got their stuff together. So I think that's an interesting, that was a little bit of a sidebar there. But we do have a lot of questions about how well Kathy is going to be able to wield her sexuality, and whether or not, in fact, whether or not she and Adam are actually having any sex. We also, that's a great segue. One of the main questions of the book, you will recall, and this is from early on in the text, is the question of who is the father of these boys, which is a big one. I mean, there is really some very fundamental questions that are posed early on, and you expect an answer at some point. There's also this sense of the boys as discovering their mother's secret. We're always wondering if they are, in fact, going to realize that their mother is, in fact, a sex worker and someone who has a lot of power in these houses of sex workers that are only, I think they're in Gilroy or Watsonville or in the county seat. I think it's maybe Salinas. I can't quite remember, my memory. But, they're like, 15 miles away, and these are not large towns. And, Salinas, I think, is like the big city and is the county seat. So, in fact, it's a big city. But, there are only 2 houses with sex workers in them. So there's this whole question throughout of like, are these boys who are becoming teenagers and who are becoming sexual themselves, are they, in fact, going to figure out that their mother is, in fact, someone who abandoned them in order to become a sex worker? So we also have a question of whether Abra, who is a very important woman character later in the book, whether or not which sort of brother she is going to end up with. So we have these really large questions that are really keeping us reading, but we also have these much smaller arcs. The one that I have noted here is at one point, Lee, who is really, I think, one of the heroes of the book. It's just really an incredible character. In fact, a little bit like Percival Everett's James, in the sense that he is someone who has come from China, and we learn about his really tragic backstory. And he is someone who is working with this family of men after Kathy leaves them, and is really heroic in lots and lots of ways, but who is always very careful to present to his employers and to all white people, sort of the typical stereotype of an Asian employee, an Asian servant. And you, in fact, realize that he is incredibly well read, just like Percival Everett's James, and that he has, this very, very erudite sort of bearing, and that his language is in fact very sophisticated, but that he speaks in this kind of pidgin English. That's what he calls it, this pidgin English, because that is in fact what white people are expecting of him. So at one point, there's this very small concern, apparently it's on page 454 in my book, where you're really worried about him. And it was so energizing for me, because it really added to the tension in the book. And it's a little story arc that is resolved actually fairly soon thereafter. It's like a 4 or 5 page thing. But I really didn't feel like I wanted to stop reading at that point, because I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen with Lee here? So I think that there are both these larger arcs and lots of these smaller arcs that really, in fact, keep us reading. We're going to very quickly work through some of the weaknesses of the novel. So this idea of recycling the biblical story. So, we spoke in the beginning about East of Eden and the original story of Cain and Abel. What gets to be a little, I think, heavy-handed is the fact that we have in each generation this sort of succession of these Cain and Abel figures. So we have Cyrus to begin with, then we have Charles and Adam, and then the next generation is Caleb and Aaron. We also have Kathy, who is very much like Charles and Caleb. And then we also have Abra, who is like Adam and Aaron. And it gets to be a bit, I think, it's not even like heavy-handed. It just gets to be like a little obvious and kind of a little bit too much, a little too much. I'm just going to say it. So it's very clear, and I think a lot of readers, in fact, would appreciate that. To me, it seemed a little bit more than Steinbeck needed to do, simply because we're following along. We got it. The Cain and Abel motif is well established with the first generation. I'm not sure we need the very clear distinction in every generation that follows. No offense, John Steinbeck. But I will say that this idea of the biblical is really, it's very apt. I mean, I am someone who is agnostic/atheistic, and I'm not like super familiar with the Bible, although Castellea, my alma mater, they had us do a whole year with this book called, I think it was a whole year, it felt like a year, of this book called The Bible as/in Literature. So we studied the Bible, which actually, I mean, really great. Apparently I did not absorb as much of it as I could, but I do in fact understand that the reason why the Bible endures, aside from being a lot of people's, essence, is because, in fact, those are some big themes. I mean, the Bible is nothing if not a compendium of very large themes. So when we are talking about the story of Cain and Abel, which is one that I think most people, even if you are not Christian, have in mind, or Jewish, or, in any of the Judeo-Christian faiths. But we have these giant themes like jealousy and betrayal and good and evil, and the idea of original sin, the idea of predestination versus free will, the idea of this idea of Timshel, which is this idea that comes up again and again and again throughout the novel, and was in fact very important to Steinbeck. All of these are very important biblical themes that are important for a reason, because those are all things that are also very, sort of fundamentally human. A lot of drama that comes in our lives and that makes for good fiction, in fact, grows out of these themes that are very biblical. The last thing we're going to talk about here is the portrayal of women and the racism. So I want to take a look on page 19. This is early in the novel, and at this point, our omniscient third-person narrator is very close to the sort of thinking of Cyrus, who is in fact the patriarch and sort of the seeds in many ways of all of the kind of yuck that's going to come after it. So you have to take this with a bit of a grain of salt because, in fact, it is a pretty reprehensible character who is stating this. But it is also an attitude that lots of men in the novel have toward women. And this is certainly one of the reasons why a lot of people look at the book as being very misogynist. So here we go. Again, page 19. And let me tell you, this is like not great. This is not a great quotation here on like many, many different levels. Cyrus wanted a woman to take care of Adam. He needed someone to keep house and cook, and a servant cost money. I mean, yikes. He was a vigorous man and he needed the body of a woman, and that too cost money, unless you were married to it. I mean, even more yikes. Within 2 weeks, Cyrus had wooed, wedded, bedded, and impregnated her. His neighbors did not find his action hasty. It was quite normal in that day for a man to use up 3 or 4 wives in a normal lifetime. Yikes. Okay, so again, this is Cyrus talking, and Cyrus is pretty reprehensible, but also, this idea of the third person narrator as saying, like, no one thought this was hasty and no one had a problem with this. I mean, we're very closely aligning as the narrator, this omniscient, supposedly neutral voice is really in many ways, saying that this is fine, what Cyrus is doing here. So that's pretty horrific. It's at the beginning of the novel. And in fact, Alice Trask, who is Cyrus's wife, really has a difficult time of it. And in fact, Cain's mother. So we have this idea of women as being really used for sex, which costs money if you don't have a wife, if you're not married to it, which is just disgusting. And also women as replacing a servant, essentially. So we begin with this really negative vision of women, and in fact, it holds in many cases throughout. And the depiction of Kathy, again, as a monster, like named as a monster many times, does not do a lot to dispel this idea of women as simply kind of a servant that you don't have to pay for, and someone you can disparage, and you can go through 3 or 4 of them in a lifetime. But here's what I will say. Is that Mrs. Trask, in fact, does, in fact, end up having quite a bit of strength. So, and there's this idea of, at one point somebody describes Kate was so goddamn clever. So there's this idea of her being clever and being resourceful. Kathy, again, is someone who is very, very strong. And then we have Abra, who is a woman who is really in control of both of the young men who are the sort of final, they're the last generation that we are looking at. At one point, Abra says, I guess girls aren't afraid of anything. And Abra really is, she's a very competent and a very influential character. So I think we have this kind of balance. We have a lot of like talking and a lot of actually treating women badly throughout the novel, but we also have these very, very strong women who I think, it's not like a feminist book in any way, but it also, in fact, is giving us an example of women who are very strong and very competent. And in fact, this is a very good segue into the last thing we're going to discuss, which is this notion of racism. So certainly the depictions of Asian people in particular, and of the Irish in this case, are not great, but I would definitely argue that Samuel Harris and that Lee are, in fact, really the heroes of the book. I mean, Lee is one of these, he's sort of like in many ways the bedrock. I mean, he becomes essentially the primary caretaker of these boys. He becomes a primary taker, in fact, of their father as well. He's very smart. He has overcome all sorts of odds. And he is a character who we have spanning almost the entire novel, and really is one of the only people who is really just sort of foundationally good in many ways. So he's very bright. He's very compassionate. He's very loyal. He really is sort of the ideal citizen in many ways. And we also have some depictions of his community in San Francisco and these kind of elders who are also very intelligent. And again, his Chinese heritage, he was actually born in the United States. So a lot is made of the fact that Lee is American. Lee is just as American as all the rest of the people, and in fact grew up speaking English, despite the fact that he feels like he needs to speak in this kind of pidgin register to give white people what they want. But you have this idea of people who are either recent immigrants, first generation people like Lee, or immigrants like Samuel Hamilton. They really do, in fact, become very heroic. And they're, again, people who are sort of unadulterated goodness, as opposed to everyone else in the Trask family. The town itself is also, it's not like a cultural, hotbed, but we have a lot of different people in the town who, we have Italian people, we have German people, we have this Swiss family. So you have all of these people who have come from far, far away and are all in California at the end of the 19th century in order to build this town, but they're incredibly industrious and incredibly resourceful. So certainly, again, this book is not a feminist treatise, and it is also not a celebration of, the immigration population in California, but it is, in fact, I think, showing us some examples of that population, both the women and the recent immigrant population, in ways I think that are at least somewhat flattering. Okay, now we're going to close. And I'm so happy about this because often if I'm trying to talk about a book and not sort of spoil the plot, it's very difficult to talk about the ending, obviously. But in this case, it's actually very easy because I can talk about this one concept without, in fact, giving away any of the plot. So the biblical nature of the book has been well established, I think. And one of the things that keeps coming up over and over is this notion of timshel. And that is a Hebrew word. It is one, in fact, that Lee does a lot of thinking about. He and his community of elders, his wise community in San Francisco, spend lots and lots of time sort of learning Hebrew, in fact, in order to really get to the essence of this word timshel, which of course I loved. I mean, the linguist in me was like, I am all for these, very wise Chinese-speaking men really focusing all of their time on learning Hebrew so they can really understand this term. So this term timshel, in fact, has to do with conquering. So it is this kind of biblical mandate, this mandate from God of either thou will conquer or thou shall conquer. So it's this mandate toward conquering. But what happens when these people really dig into how it should be translated, they come up with an alternate translation, which is thou may conquer. So this idea of thou may, this idea of having permission, and this idea of like giving agency to you, in this case, is very significant in the sense that it's giving free will, it's giving agency. So if we look at this novel, which is this kind of multi-generational saga, if we look at it as this question, this very important biblical question between predestination, that God has a path for you and you essentially are following along, or free will, this idea of timshel as being you may conquer gives agency back to the person. So I think one of the ways to interpret that is, and timshel is one of the words that is spoken at the very end of the novel. So this idea of giving agency back to someone, saying you may conquer or you may not, it's up to you. That idea, in fact, goes against all of the predestination that has come before. This sense that, you're fated if your name begins with a C, that you're going to do some dastardly deed. And if it begins with an A, that you're sort of too good for this world. In fact, at the end, we have this idea of free will that may, in fact, be sort of pointing to a situation where, in fact, this free will is going to allow the next generation to, in fact, not be so tied to this predestination. So I was very happy to look at the end and realize that we could talk about it in these terms. I mean, that's a much bigger conversation in some ways, but I really did like the idea of Steinbeck closing the novel with this biblical idea, and one that actually really relies fairly heavily on Lee, again, he being, I would argue, the hero of the book. Okay, so thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for hanging in this discussion of East of Eden. And if this is an old favorite, I hope this has helped you remember, in fact, why it was so good. And if it's something that you're planning on reading or you've just finished reading, I hope that you enjoyed your deep dive and that today gave you a little better sense of why, in fact, it is a book that really resonates with a lot of people and really registers as one of their very favorite books. I mean, Nobel Prize. I mean, I think you did a good job. Anything you want to add? Anything, any last words for us? Thanks for joining me. Happy reading.